Just real quick, again, I'm Jay Sundberg with the AME Group. The AME Group is a IT solutions provider for businesses of all sizes, industries, you name it. We provide critical services to keep your organizations running. I manage the security services component within the AME Group. We're a separate unit. We do network security, cybersecurity, monitoring, configuration, and we also do a large amount of compliance. We're helping customers go through, meet their requirements, identify their requirements. So that's really in line with what we're going to talk about today when dealing with the WISP. So that's a little bit about me and the AME group. Let's talk about the WISP and what this is coming from and what we're supposed to achieve with it. So this all stems from a 1999 law called the Gramm-Leach Bliley Act, where they've established rules that they wanted financial institutions to follow to protect customer data, consumer data, financial information. Well, it was a pretty big sweeping change at the time for 1999, quite a few years ago. As part of that, though, different organizations had responsibilities for the enforcement of it. So the FTC had some responsibilities in which you fall under to enforce the GLBA and help us protect this personal financial information. So in the GLBA, they actually mention tax preparation services as being a financial institution. It was in there. It's very long bill. There's a lot to read. It just wasn't surfaced. It wasn't really visible. It kind of flew under the radar for quite some time. Well, as a nation, as an industry, as enterprises are evolving, the focus on protecting that information, preventing unauthorized access to that information has come to the top. Obviously, you guys are aware of it. You see it every day. So, in an effort to help make this more attainable, more clear, and provide better guidance, the FTC has released what they call the Safeguards Rule. And the Safeguards Rule is really what's driving this written information security plan. IRS adopted that as the guidance for tax preparers, and as you know, you had a requirement the last time you updated your information to acknowledge that you had a written information security plan. So it caused a little bit of chaos. It was coming, it had been planned, but when they suddenly put a date on it and said you have to have it by this date, it was a problem. So we're going to walk through some of these today, what we can do to help accomplish those. I do have a couple links I want to paste into the chat. And if you have the ability to pull these up simultaneously, you can. If not, you can refer to them a little later. I'm just going to put them in here real quick, and then we'll get moving. One more. So there's three pieces that are going to be pretty applicable to our conversation today. One of them is the FTC Safeguards Rule. You can go view it online at that link I just provided, or you can Google it later. Just type in FTC Safeguards Rule. It'll come up all over the place. This rule is the foundation that everything is being driven from. It's really pretty clearly written. It's not all that difficult. It is in government speak to some degree, so you just got to, squint with one eye and you can read through it. But really good to take a look at it and get familiar with it. If you look at that link and you scroll down to about 2/3 of the way through the document, you get to a section 3.14.4. That's the elements, and that actually describes what needs to be in a information security plan. So the IRS, in their guidance, has created a sample information security plan that you can see at the link I provided there. It's IRS Pub 5708. In that, it's a good example. It is not one that you could copy and just change some stuff in it and use it for your plan. It wouldn't be sufficient in that regard. And they did that on purpose. They're leaving some elements out so that people don't just clone it. But take a look at it, and you can align the items in the sample plan with the requirements in the safeguards rule, and you can see the correlation and where they're going with this, and you just get a better understanding. It's better to have that good understanding as you go into this process, and know what you're trying to achieve as you come out of it. So before you spend too much time establishing, your draft of a plan or your project plan of how you're going to implement one, take a few minutes to look at the actual safeguards rule itself and that sample plan that the IRS put together. And those two pieces will really give you, I think, a better understanding of where we're trying to go and what we're trying to accomplish. So the end game here is that we're trying to protect personal information, personal identifiable information, personal financial information. So keep that in mind as we're going through this, because the written information security plan only applies to the systems that house that information or process it or transmit it, and the users that access that information or other systems. So it doesn't necessarily apply to everything within your organization, but it's probably going to apply to most of it, since you're in the business of doing tax preparation work. But keep that in mind, because it affects obviously your cost and effort to implement these measures as you go forward. So we refer to that as what's in scope. So as we talk about the scope, that is any items that involve that information. There is a line for exceptions in this information security plan. So if you have fewer than 5,000 customers, there are components that we don't need to do. We don't need to have a written risk assessment. We still have to conduct a risk assessment to do the activities we need to create the plan, but it doesn't have to be a formal written document. You also aren't required to do continuous monitoring or penetration tests and vulnerability testing. Um, a periodic is all you need, but for organizations larger than 5,000 customers, they need some additional services. The written incident response plan. Every organization has to have an incident response plan. For the IRS requirements, they're saying it doesn't have to be written if you have fewer than 5,000 customers. I'm just going to tell you, you'd be nuts to not have a written incident response plan, period. So even though you don't need it to meet their requirement, you do need it to meet cyber insurance requirements, any other potential state regulations you may have. You're going to need it from, if you're working with larger corporations, they're going to want to see a written incident response plan before they engage in business with you. It's just become a matter of fact. You just have to have that to conduct business today. And then also the other exception being that you don't have to provide a written report to your board of directors. You still have to report your status and your security posture, but it doesn't have to be a formal written report. So with that being said, is there anybody in today's presentation discussion that has more than 5,000 customers? If you do, you could just raise your hand with the little raise your hand icon, or you could chat something in there. The reason I ask is those requirements to achieve these four items that are excluded for less than 5,000 is pretty substantial. And if you do have that need, you can reach out to me. I'll give you my email address at the end of this, and we could go through what you need to do to achieve those. So just a little information there on uh, what's applicable to you and what may not be applicable to you. So the safeguards rule, take a look at that, compare it to the sample information security plan, and that should give you a pretty good grasp of what we're going to try and achieve. So the security plan itself has several major elements to it. Um, a little bit of the administrative point up front, the objectives, the purpose, the scope. So objectives, what are we doing this for? Why are we doing it? And the scope is, what are we doing it to, right? Um, Going back to systems that contain this personal financial information, that either transmit it or process it, or the individuals, the people that access that information. So we want to keep that in mind. Identify responsible individuals. Pretty easy. Most organizations are going to be smaller in size, that you're going to have probably one person responsible for this plan. Others might have the ability to add two or three and spread it around a little bit. But who's responsible? Define their role. Say as a security officer, as our data custodian, whatever that role is that you want to use. There's some language in the sample plan that you can use. But get that person identified, who's responsible, contact info, and so on. The risk assessment is really going to be probably the most detailed part of your effort, in conjunction with number 5, documenting the safety measures. Those two are really going to be the bulk of work. The risk assessment doesn't have to be overly complex, and I've got some tools that we're going to look at as we go through this to help you achieve that. And um, then you can work on the plan. Inventory of not only hardware but software and other assets that are involved. Again, documenting the safety measures. There's a lot of work to do in that component. We'll go through some of that. The implementation clause is, again, more of an administrative. We put these controls into effect on such and such date, or we plan to put them into effect on such and such date. Violations could be this, and so on. The sample does give you a good um, approach to doing that. And then attachments and supporting evidence. So it's great that you have a plan, and maybe you have one currently today and you're just looking to improve it, or you're looking to build one that you don't have in existence yet. But the attachments and supporting evidence are going to be required should you actually get audited. So currently, all the IRS wants is that you have a plan, and you attest to the fact that you have a plan. If something happens, if you have a breach, let's say you have an email compromise, somebody gets access to a mailbox. In that mailbox were some tax returns for individuals. Then we find out that that individual whose mailbox was compromised actually had information going back for 2 years in their mailbox, and the attacker had all that information available. Now you have to report that as a breach, and that's when you are subject to an audit as a follow-up to an incident. If they come in to do the audit and you don't have evidence to show that you're doing all the things you said you were doing in your plan, you're going to have a hard time justifying the fact that you have a plan that's functional. And that opens the door for penalties. So as we go through this process, you want to keep in mind that you want to be able to capture the evidence that you're actually doing what you say you're doing in the plan. And you want to keep that current, and we'll get into that as we talk about maintaining. So a little bit of focus on these key areas for today's conversation. And I will say also that the written information security plan can be used for more than just meeting this IRS requirement. It can be used to present to your cyber insurance underwriter for when you're doing your renewal or a new policy. These are the things we're doing to protect our environment. It can go a long way to either reducing premiums or giving you increased coverage without raising premiums. So there's benefit to that. It also proves that you're taking it seriously and putting the practices and controls in place to protect that data. So it makes you more attractive to customers. So gives you a competitive edge and can go a long way in those areas as well. So keep in mind, this can be multi-purpose. So when we actually get to creating the information security plan itself, there's another piece that you can reference that I think will be very helpful for you if you have the time, and that is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. I've included it in the chat window. It's the last item, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 1.1. This is a well-used, well-respected framework for conducting risk analysis, for evaluating your environment, for conducting inventory, for considering your governance and policies. It really covers all the bases in a general sense. It doesn't get too detailed in any one area. And these items that are listed in here, these functions of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, are all items that are going to be addressed in the information security plan that we have to put together for our requirements. So you can utilize it, and the references associated with each of those functions will point you at other documents that will give you more detailed information about those items and give you some ideas about how you may want to implement them, how it may or may not apply to your environment. So a really good resource, very easy to read, and especially when you get straight to the core requirements. The front matter is about 20 some pages of, again, government speak. But when you get down to looking at the actual requirements and the guidance they provide, it can be very helpful in understanding what information should really go into your plan. So I highly recommend that you take a look at that as well. And these these are the pieces we're going to use to guide us through the development of our information security plan. And the NIST cybersecurity framework is going to be revised because it's been so well accepted and used that they're actually coming out with a new version of it at the beginning of next year, probably, that is going to include a lot of the requirements for meeting the various compliance standards. So familiarity with it will go a long way for you in the long run. Okay, the development is function before form, right? So you got that sample report that you can look at, and yep, looks nice. Everything's laid out. We got our objectives, we got our elements, everything's documented. But to get to that, we have to do a lot of work. We got to do a lot of data collection. We got to do a lot of analysis. And those pieces are all going to lead to the report itself. So rather than just jump in and start trying to draft your information security plan from a blank document or following that sample, what I'm going to do is walk you through some of the steps you can take to collect that information, analyze that data, and then after processing it, then be able to build your plan based on facts of your environment, what's in your environment, what's needed for your environment, and go from there. So we start at the beginning, and then we just work our way through that process until we get to the end of it. A couple items to help you get started. If you have the ability to add other people to this effort, um, I like to call it a committee. We have what we call an ISMS committee. It is their job to um, evaluate our compliance. It's make recommendations about changes we need to comply with requirements. They don't do the work; they just oversee it. So this is a could be a large undertaking for some organizations. It might not be so big for others, but if you can have a couple of people involved in this planning and reviewing the WISP itself and establishing the requirements that your organization is going to follow, it just relieves the burden of one person trying to do it. It gives you partners to share and bounce ideas off of. So I highly encourage you to involve uh, several people in this process if at all possible. It'll make your output much better in the end. Uh, Collecting the required data and information. Lot to do in that. We'll unpack that one as we go through this, but there's just a lot that you want to look at initially. The goal of this is identifying what do we need to protect? What's in the environment? What's in that scope? Right. So we really want to get that scope nailed down and be very factual about what we have. We don't want to gloss over something. We don't want to forget about, oh, we have this one system that we use, or maybe we don't use it anymore. It's just for reference. If it's archived, we need to go look at it, but we have to know what's there so that we can consider it in our controls and how we're going to protect it. And then reviewing and analyzing the possible risks associated with all that information, coming up with a plan to mitigate those risks. These are going to be the controls. I use it. That's a term, in this realm. We have controls for physical issues, administrative issues, and technical issues. So our plan is going to address all those risks with at least one, if not a minimum of two, of those control types: administrative, technical, or physical. Then we're going to assign responsibilities for the components of the WISP, not just the entire WISP. We've already, somebody's going to do that, but we're going to have different sections that different people might have responsibility for. Uh, as far as maybe implementing the security controls, that might be one individual or several others, but managing the plan and so on is going to be a different person or people. And then we get to actually document our results in the form of the written information security plan. So there's a lot of steps to get us there. One of the other things that we probably want to do right off the bat before beginning down this process is designate an executive sponsor. Who in the organization, from an executive or principal level, can guide the team, understand the risks associated with not fulfilling these requirements, and have the authority within the organization to enforce it, to get things done. So, sometimes, a lot of times these will fall on IT. They'll say, well, here, this is all technology related. We're going to give it to IT, let them run with it. They can only go so far. You need to have that executive leadership as a component of this that can run interference, that can clear roadblocks, that can commit resources. So, number one, and it should have been a big number one up here, is identify who's going to be that executive sponsor for this effort. And they don't have to maintain it going forward. This just initially, this is who's going to own it from the sponsorship side and help us get across the finish line. Long term, you're going to want somebody for sure, always involved, reporting to them periodically, quarterly, weekly, whatever the case may be. But you definitely have to have that executive sponsorship. I've seen too many of these efforts either fail or just struggle and cost way more time and money than you need it to, because you didn't have an executive running road interference for you and making things happen. So strongly recommend that. If anybody does have any questions or thoughts, you can feel free to put them in the chat window and we'll get you answers as well. So on creating that committee, right? We want to assign responsibility to people and spread out this workload wherever we can. So we already went over in summary, and we'll get into them in detail, the various components of the plan. And when you're working with multiple people, it's much easier to break those pieces out and assign them as tasks for that one individual to manage. So maybe some of the administrative components of the plan around the objectives, the scope, and so on is one individual. Risk analysis might be something you do as a group, but somebody has to be responsible for the task, coordinate, scheduling it, making sure the analysis performed. And so trying to look at how we break those pieces out. This is really just a project. So it's really nothing more than project management principles. So as we're going through this process, we want to make sure that we've got that documented, know who's going to do what, when they're going to do it, so that we can establish a schedule. We can plan our execution around it. We know when the dates are going to be done or supposed to be done, and we can measure our progress and make sure we're moving on this and getting things accomplished. So getting that team together would be a crucial step, and then letting the team develop that project plan and flesh it out before starting to implement it. Talked about the executive sponsor, making sure that you've got that leadership that's going to support your efforts and help you achieve them, get things out of the way, get you resources, whatever the case may be. Documenting the goal. What are we trying to accomplish with this effort from the project management standpoint? Getting our committee together. Let's make sure we've got the right people, and that people can change. You don't have to have the same people on this effort throughout the course of it. Maybe you have a specific task where somebody in your organization is better suited for that. Well, bring them in. Let them work in that specific area, and then you can release them, bring someone else in to focus on a different specific area. And then look at defining roles around the security aspect itself. A security officer, a privacy officer. Communications are going to be required in an incident response scenario where we've got to now communicate either to the public, to our governing bodies, to the board. Internally, we've got to communicate to law enforcement. There's a lot of different pieces to unpack in that, and dedicating someone to that responsibility allows them to focus on the tasks they need to do, while others are focusing on the other tasks associated with the security plan itself. So identifying those roles, putting a bit of a job description to it, if you will. These are the responsibilities of the security officer. These are the responsibilities of the data privacy officer or data custodian, or just privacy. But outline those as roles within your organization, assign them real responsibilities that have meaning and impact this security plan, so that we've got accountability, we've got clear direction, and we can achieve those results. So even if it's just you, then designate yourself as a security officer so that we can move forward with it, document what those responsibilities are going to be, and that way we can achieve those goals in the end. All right, collecting the required data. So we've done some administrative stuff. We've got our plan, our project plan. We know how we're going to move forward. Now we need to go about getting the data so that we can then conduct our risk analysis. So the data that we need to collect is all going to be around inventory information, hardware, software, staffing. What are the tools we use? Let me see here. Yep. Cloud services. People seem to forget about that a lot of times, and external information systems. So it's not uncommon today. As a matter of fact, it's more common than not that you're using a subscription service of some sort. You've got an application that's cloud-based, and all you do is I pay per user per month. You don't really have any control over that platform. Well, we still need to know it exists. We still need to know what data is in it. And then we need to know who has access to it. How do they access it? Because those things are going to go into our risk analysis and help us determine if we need to have other factors involved for protecting that and controlling access to it. Where is my data stored? And what type of data is it? So this is really key to defining the scope. Again, we only need to be concerned with systems that are contain, transmit, or process this taxpayer information. So we want to keep it as narrow as possible. And we have to identify where is all our data, and then identify that data as saying, okay, this one's got tax return info, this one's got customer contact lists, this one has bank statements or financial statements, and go through those and identify where all those are, and again, who has access to it and how they access it, because those are going to feed our risk analysis. So depending on the services you're using, this could be an exercise that you literally could take 10 minutes and do, or it could take 2 days. It just depends on the individual environment. We use a series of automated tools to help us collect all that information. But even that, even after the hundreds of pieces of information we've got, software that's installed everywhere, all the computers, patches, all that stuff, we still have to sit down, look at it, and then put human intelligence behind it. What does this mean that we have this data? Where is that information? And what else can we do? So looking here at Charles' question, how do you answer that for cloud tax software? Is it the vendor server? And we have to get that from the vendor. So it depends. It's right. Nice, clear answer for you. So some services you use, you have no control over that system whatsoever, other than you might be able to create a user account for someone else in your company to use. If that's the case, then we can only focus on the controls that you have access to, which would be, I verified that this user has their need to know. I've created their account. They meet the password requirements, and we've enabled MFA. We've restricted their access to only coming from this location, which is our main office, and that's it. And because that's the only controls available to you to affect. Now, if it's a server that you have hosted somewhere and you have full control over that server, then there's a lot more that we're going to need to look at, because now you have to protect that entire system. And then there's all kinds of other solutions that would be in between that, right? So it depends on what is actually within your control that's going to determine what protections and what controls we need to deal with. So just because I'm subscribing to, and this is, you guys are all probably going to laugh, but it's okay. I'm going to use QuickBooks Online because that's all that's what I know of. All I can do with QuickBooks Online is I can add a user and give them permission. I can make them accounts payable, accounts receivable. I can give them, some auditor rights perhaps, but that's it. So I have no influence over where the data is stored, how long it's retained. Those are out of my control. So I hope that explained it well enough for you, Charles. What you can do, though, from those vendors that manage systems or services that you don't control, is you need to dictate to them, I need your attestation of your security practices, whether it's a SOC 2 report, whether it's uh, a written information security plan, since we're talking about the IRS rules, whether it's a third-party audit of the FTC safeguards. These vendors are going to have to provide this information. One of the requirements in the WISP is around your supply chain, your partners, your vendors that you're working with, and that you enforce security requirements on them. So the vendor has to demonstrate that they are living up to the same level of protections that you are. If they're managing your data, housing your data, or any aspect of it, they have to have the same or similar controls that you're having. So the way we get that is we ask them, give us your certification, your attestation, You can ask them questions, say, complete this survey for me. Everybody in here's got to have seen a cyber insurance um, renewal survey in the last year to 2 years. I mean, these things are getting crazy. I saw one the other day. It was 16 pages of questions. That's not with, not double spacing or anything. It was 16 pages of information they wanted you to answer to help quote you a rate. They're doing that to reduce their risk. So if they know that you don't have these controls in place, your premiums go up, your coverages are limited, and they're going to make sure that they're not financially at risk in that policy. You're doing the same thing with your vendors. You don't want to put yourself at risk for a breach because something one of your vendors is doing. So you want to keep that in mind, and that is a component of the information security plan. So reference to supply chain risk management is the common term for that. So this is just in the data collection. So we've spent, probably more time talking about it at this point than some people put into actually doing the data collection. There's a lot to consider. And as you look at pieces of that data, it should lead you to say, well, wait a second. If I see that on this, I know we're accessing it from over here. How come I don't see it over there? Oh, we didn't look over there. Well, let's go look over there. So you start following some of those breadcrumbs to make a more complete picture of what is in your environment so you can define that scope that we need to protect. Takes time, takes breaks, collect data, pause, collect more data, review it, pause. It's just a bit of a process. But without a good inventory, and if we're following the NIST cybersecurity framework, this is under that identify function. Without a good inventory, we run the risk of blowing our risk analysis completely. We don't have the right things to look at. We're not considering the right information. So we're off on the wrong path, and we end up with a product that actually doesn't protect our environment at all. Critical piece to our efforts here. Excuse me, I got a little itchy eyeball. All right, so now we're going to get into the risk analysis. This is a pretty lengthy process if you do it properly. No, I shouldn't say lengthy. It's very thought-provoking, right? We're going to do a lot of mental cycles on this one, work through possible scenarios, discuss conditions. What if this, or what if that? When this happens, those are the things that we're going to work through in this risk analysis phase. So we're using that inventory, all that information we've collected about people, processes, systems, data, and so on. And we're going to evaluate that and try to determine from our best guess aspect, what are the potential risks in these systems? We have a system online housed with a vendor. A potential risk would be number one, unauthorized access. A user that we haven't established as credentialed somehow gained access to that information. So that's a potential risk. So we'll identify that. What if that hosted service goes offline, isn't available? Whether it's due to a failure or security and whatever, the outcome is that it's not available. What's the impact of that? Is that a risk to our organization? And you start just working through these exercises. It's nothing but questions, 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 and then trying to come up with answers at the end. Don't come up with answers in the middle of it. Let's get the questions laid out. Let's determine what the possible risk is. Then we can worry about coming up with solutions. But we want to identify those risks and say, what's the impact should this happen? And then what do we do to prevent it? And that's where we start looking at those solutions. So really a good process to follow. We all do risk analysis and risk management on a daily basis. We do it in our heads. We do it with almost every decision we make. So it's not something you're incapable of doing. You already know how to do it. This is just dealing with it in a bigger scope. It's like, oh man, there's a lot to consider here. So again, having a process that you'll utilize, that you can follow through with, document, and so on will make it a lot easier for you. We're going to look at some tools here in just a second. But I did want to highlight the Small Business Information Security handout. It's down here, number 4 on this slide, NIST.ir.7621R1. You can look for that number. Just Google that, NIST.ir. This is a really good reference of how to conduct a risk analysis. And a couple of the slides I'm going to show you next, I took out of that document. It's very workable, and it's just digestible. You can read through it and put it to action pretty quickly. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of those. So number one, we're going to identify and prioritize our information types. So that was all part of our inventory. We collected that inventory to identify where data is, what type of data it is, and from there we can determine some of these factors, right? So if we're looking here, cost of revelation, confidentiality, cost to verify information, integrity, and cost of lost access, availability. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability are the three stools or legs of the stool for security. So they're referred to as the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And everything we do looking at the risks, we want to evaluate it from that standpoint. What's it going to cost us if um, unauthorized people see this information? If this information is released to the public somehow, um, or is manipulated or corrupted and is no longer accurate. That's what we're talking about with confidentiality. With integrity, I'm sorry, integrity, we're talking about accuracy, where the data is not been manipulated. It is in the state that we wanted it in. We put it in that state. Uh, and we're able to evaluate it and measure it to make sure it doesn't change. So those two are key. And then availability, that goes to the uptime, downtime. Thank you, Lisa. Lisa put a link to this small business document in the chat window. The availability is a security risk from the standpoint of there's a attack methodology called denial of service. I'm sure you've probably heard of it. Where attackers just flood a system or service with millions and millions of requests, and the service can't respond, or it tries to respond and overutilizes its resources and crashes. That's availability. So, there's capacity planning goes into that. There's a lot to factor into it, but at this high level, is it up or down? Let's just worry about it that way. Integrity, is the data um, secure? I put it there. I expect it to be there when I go back to it, and I expect it to be in the state it was when I left it. And then confidentiality, how do I know who accessed that information, and when they accessed it, and where they accessed it from? So, let's keep them at a high level topic or a high level thought process, and it can drive us through this. So as you're going through, we're identifying uh, vendor A's system up here in the first box. We'll say from confidentiality, we don't have much to consider on that one. We're more concerned with availability. So we're going to say confidentiality is going to be medium or low. Integrity is going to be medium or low, but availability is going to be high. That's our big concern. Then we're going to look at cost of lost work. So now we're starting to factor in some things outside of the security element. What's its impact, right? So I can't access that system for 2 days. What's it going to cost me to go back and do all the work that we lost for 2 days? Are there any fines or penalties involved in this? Is there customer notifications involved in this? And then we can associate that as a high, medium, or low. From the scenario here, the vendor system that's hosted, I'm going to say the cost of lost work is going to be high, because we've got people we're paying for 2 days that can't do anything, and then all of a sudden they've got 4 days worth of work to do in the next 2 days, so that's going to be a high cost to us. We don't have any fines or penalties or customer notification to work through on this one, so that's going to be a low. And then other legal costs. So other legal costs can be anything. You guys have probably been around some of it more so than I have, but the other legal costs are going to involve things in a breach scenario around providing identity protection services for those that were compromised. It'll involve possible lawsuits. It'll involve engaging your legal counsel to deal with an incident response, which I highly recommend. That when something happens, we'll get into it in a little bit, but one of your first calls should be to your legal counsel. You want their guidance on what needs to be done, and you want their advice on what should be done. You're going to have a lot to say in it. Obviously, it's your organization and your responsibility, but that professional guidance from that legal counselor is going to be key to what you guys do next. When do we contact law enforcement, and so on. But anyway, so the other legal costs, in this case, with our scenario, are going to be low. We shouldn't even have any, but we'll go with that. Reputation, public relations costs. Well, that could be high. We got customers expecting us to turn around and deliver our services to them, and now we have to tell them we can't because this failure from our vendor. It could certainly impact you long term from that perspective. It could impact you short term. Customers could say, well, then the heck with it, don't do it, I'll go somewhere else and get it done. So you want to evaluate that and tag it appropriately. On this one, I'll say it's a high. Let's stick with it. And then cost to identify and repair the problem. In our case, we can't identify or repair anything. It's the vendor. We're stuck. Um, so our cost is going to be low. And then our overall score, the way and you can read about it in that Small Business Institute document. But if I have a high on anything, my overall score is going to be a high. If my highest mark on any of these items is a medium, my overall score is going to be a medium. I'm going to take whatever my highest item is, my highest ranking, and that's what my overall score is going to be. And then we can further discuss and debate that as we move through the risk analysis process, but at least it calls it out that we know we have at least one high concern within this first column for this scenario of this vendor hosted platform. And once you work through that, now we're going to apply some of the information from our inventory, right? So we know in this case, in this example, we have Dr. J. Smith's cell phone. We know what type of phone it is, its operating system, and what its name is, its location, and the types of information on it. This may not be so applicable to you guys in the sense of tax work, but it certainly would be in the sense of contact information. I know I have full access to all my email on my phone. All my contacts are there. Some of the attachments in those emails are there. So it could be a risk item. More applicable to you guys might be the actually application that's housing that data that you rely on daily to do that work. And then we would want to list what's that type of information. Like I said, tax records, financial records, whatever the case may be, previous year tax forms, and then what's the overall potential impact if that information is compromised through either a confidentiality, availability, or integrity standpoint. And this is impact to the business that we're talking about, and just start to give it those rankings. So when we look at that inventory that we collect, we're looking at the computers, servers, software, and so on, and we want to be able to look at those and identify in each of them, obviously its location and its overall impact, as well as the type of information that that system either houses or accesses. And the reason you need to know information it accesses is that we need to know where information flows within the organization so that it can be protected. So if I'm accessing something from my computer that sits on a server in our office up in Indiana, then I need to know all the pieces that are in that path, because if that path breaks, now I lost my availability. What's the impact to me or the organization because I can no longer access that? So you can see where that inventory collection is really meaningful on how we're going to define what we have to evaluate in our risk analysis. So we're just going to continue through the risk analysis process, identifying or documenting each of our pieces that we've already identified, as well as this other supporting information that we're going to determine or use to determine how critical is that device. And then we're going to take the results of that, apply them back over on this third table where we're talking about the specific device itself and evaluating it from the confidentiality, integrity, and availability standpoints. And again, the same rankings, high, medium, and low. Again, overall likelihood, anything that I tag as whatever the highest item in here I tag, whether it's high, then my overall is going to be a high. If it's a medium, it'll be a medium. And if all I come up with is low, then it'll be a low. So this likelihood, the reason you're doing this is we're going to then, we already identified the devices. We've now gone through and identified the risks associated with those devices or the data storage or whatever the case may be. And now we're going to prioritize those risks so that we know where to focus our efforts. We know where to budget for financially. We know where to allocate resources, and then we can work through the process. So at this point, we still haven't done we haven't done our information security plan. We're just getting the information we need to develop the information security plan. So then we can just go through and add the next device in the next column. We add the next device in the next column. This format is good for a limited number of devices. If you have a large number of devices or just more than this type of format supports, just create your own spreadsheet in Excel and just lay out your data, work on it. You can have different tabs by departments, by teams, by locations, however you want to do it. But you're going to need a tool similar to this to analyze this. It's just very thoughtful process. Identify everything, then evaluate the risks associated with everything we've identified, then prioritize those risks based on the likelihood that something's going to happen to that ID'd piece of software, hardware, whatever the case may be. Once we have the likelihoods that, okay, this is possible that this device could be compromised. If it's a high, it's a probable that it would be compromised. If it's a low, it's unlikely that it would be compromised. So if it's unlikely, it's going to go to the bottom of the priority list. If it's a high, that means it's probable, then it goes right to the top of the list. The ones that are medium are going to get another look, and you're going to kind of juggle them. If you only come up with one high priority, then we can look at the mediums and say, where do we move some of these up to get them addressed? On the other hand, if you have 20 items that rank as a high probability, then we definitely would try to prioritize within that high ranking and say, okay, this is too many for us to deal with at once. Let's get us focused down to 5, and we'll focus on those 5, then we'll focus on the next 5. So looking at another comment here, do you include non-company assets? For instance, employees have access to email on their personal phones. Does that mean their phone gets included in the inventory and analyzed? The answer to that is yes. We don't necessarily need to have the employee's phone monitored or audited in any way, but we do need to know that they are using their personal phone to access sensitive data. That's number one. So if we took that into this risk analysis and did it in that first process, here's our sensitive data. It's housed in Microsoft 365. And through our inventory, when we're looking at users, maybe is where we make that mapping. I'm looking at it and I say, okay, well, Jane Smith has access to this, that, and her email. Oh, she can get to her email from her own personal phone, as well as her company computer, as well as her web access from any computer. So now we've identified a couple of ways that Jane can actually access that information. So now that we're aware of it, we can process it from the risk standpoint and say, okay, if Jane personal cell phone, what's the likelihood of theft by a criminal? What's the likelihood of an accidental disclosure on her personal phone? It might be high in both cases. Maybe theft is less likely than just losing it. So that would certainly be a concern. And that's where we go to develop policies. Administrative controls is another term for policies that dictate what our BYOD policy is, right? Personal phones are authorized for use to access email if they meet these requirements. It must have a PIN or password to unlock the device. The device must automatically lock after 5 minutes, whatever we want to use. Company information stored on your phone must be encrypted. These are requirements we can put out there. and that users would have to meet before they'd be allowed to use their phone. So absolutely, Charles, you definitely want to include non-company assets from the standpoint of any device that has access to that information. That's why we're trying to identify it. We can't control that device. We don't own it, but we need to have that awareness that it's there being used and accessing our information. And then we can evaluate the risk of that. And then we can make a determination, you know what? We need to prevent that. We need to not allow non-company assets access to this information. And I will tell you that that's totally prudent. There's certain information that is highly controlled. We have certain information in our organization that's only accessible by certain users from certain devices. I mean, that's just the way it is. The information is where our money is. That's where the value is. Somebody steals that information, there's a ton of downside to us. So that's what we're all about, is how are we going to protect this information? Sometimes, and many times, as you go through this process, you think, man, if we do that, we're going to have a mutiny on our hands. Staff won't put up with those changes. They won't tolerate it. And to some degree, that's true. The more of your staff you involve in the process, as far as understanding this is the road we're on, giving them updates, making them feel like they've got, not making them, but giving them a voice and input into the process, the better off you're going to be from an implementation standpoint, because they'll have better understanding of what we're trying to achieve, why we're doing it, and it'll help eliminate some of those barriers. There are going to be some people that say, absolutely not. I am not putting a MFA app on my own personal phone. If you want me to access that stuff, then you got to give me a phone. Well, that's a problem we'll have to solve. Those are challenges that will come up. I'm not going to kid you, but is that you guys are going to have to make that determination from a risk standpoint. Is that a risk that we're willing to accept? If it is, that's on, good. Then you've got it, you worked it out. If it's not, then we have to take the next step and say, well, we're not willing to accept that. Here's what we're going to do about it, and deal with the consequences as they come to us. So again, that small business article, though, our reference, very helpful in doing the risk analysis. This format is easy to use. You can expand columns and add more, information to it. You can organize it in different tabs if you want to, but it'll help you really get through the process quickly, or efficiently, I should say. Now we're talking about prioritizing. So let me just go back one real quick. Our goal here is to come up with this overall likelihood, and we're going to use that to drive our prioritization. Our prioritization on implementing a control to protect us. So anything that was a high impact and a high likelihood, from going back to the 2 previous slides, becomes a priority 1, meaning this is number 1. We got to get this in place. And what I really like about this is we're focusing on detect and protect solutions first. So those are key. There's a lot of requirements, or not requirements, a lot of information available around responding, recovering, identification as well. We've done all the identification. We should be good. But this focus on, hey, this is very important to us. It's a high impact if we have a failure or breach, and it's a very high probability that it's going to happen. Then let's get in front of that with putting in place solutions for protecting it, and then detecting if something's going wrong. Those are where you'll see services around EDR, MDR, XDR, SIM. Those are some of the terms you'll see around those areas. AME Group provides all those services. We can help customers, get to these points, but this is a process. And first we have to identify what needs to be protected and what kind of actions do we need to detect. If it's a high probability, high likelihood that this device could be compromised or is at risk, but it's a low impact, then we can, change our focus a little bit. Maybe we'll look at detection, or I still would say protection would be first, but detection maybe doesn't have to be second. Maybe we want to look at recover. If we want to be able to protect it, but if something goes wrong, we want to be able to recover it quickly. If you look at, priority 3, it's a high impact but a low likelihood. Here, the focus is recommended to be response and recovery. So we've changed what we need to approach with based on what that impact and likelihood is going to be. And then once we have this, we've completed our risk analysis, and we'll have this for each item that we identified here on this slide as whatever the likelihood is, and over here on our impact. And that's that matrix that we're putting right here, impact and likelihood. And then once we have this, we've done our risk analysis. It's complete. We are now ready to start talking about what are we going to do about these risks. And this gives us the areas to focus on so that we've got a good tight subject matter, and we can move forward with that in a good, again, efficient fashion. So you can see this is a very linear process. You start at point A, you go to point B, you go to point C. It's very uncommon that you're going to branch out. There are a couple of opportunities to do things in parallel. If you can take advantage of that and you have the resources to distribute that work, that's great. But for the most part, this is a very linear A to B process. We get done, we start all over at A and do it again because it never ends. Once we have this in place, we own it for life and we have to maintain it. It's not scary. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm not trying to overcomplicate it. Quite the opposite. I'm trying to simplify it. Just going through the process and following the steps. The first time you do it, it can be mind numbing. It's not an exercise you're accustomed to. It's not a time allocation you've built into your work schedules, your lifestyle. So it is disruptive. But as you go through the process, you live, you learn, you implement better measures and practices around how you're going to do it going forward, and it just becomes a part of your everyday work life. But it is a little painful to get there at first. Uh, I mentioned that we provide a lot of the services that you need to accomplish the protections. We also provide services around conducting the risk assessments and determining, what do we do with this output now that we have it. We use a platform heavily based on automation. We use a web portal to share that information, work with you through it. All these types of uh, pieces here are for the identification. This is all inventory information. Looking at users, what can they access, what can't they access? We're looking at assets from the software standpoint, from the hardware standpoint, from network device standpoint. Anything that we can include will make our risk analysis more thorough. And then the installed software itself, hosted software, external information systems, and then if we actually have any information in your network that we have devices open to the internet for, we want to make sure those are identified. So just a process that we employ to help work through these risk assessments with our customers. It's all based on these same thing. We have to identify all the devices. We have to identify the risks associated with them, determine if that risk is a high impact, low impact, or what, and then determine the probability that it's going to be exploited, it's going to be compromised. And then once you do those two or those three things, you've got a complete risk analysis, and we can take that output to discuss and plan the measures to mitigate the risks. See, this stuff excites me. I know it's just very interesting. Every environment is completely different. Every business case is completely different. Your needs are unique to you and your organization. And this is where it gets exciting, looking at how do you create solutions to meet your needs without breaking the bank, without causing turmoil, disrupting operational aspects. This is where the challenge is. So there's things that are going to be, basic and common everywhere in every environment. You have to have endpoint protections. You have to have firewalls, things of that nature. And then you're going to get into, your unique systems and how you're going to manage those guys. So as we go through that, we use what we call a plan of action. We've identified our risks. And in this case, our risks this is a shot out of our portal. Same process you're going to follow. And you can even use these, column headings and stuff as an example. But we've identified our risk, and here we're tying them to the requirements. So if we look at the FTC safeguards, we have those requirements that are listed in that section 4, 314.4. And then we have um, where that fits in our information security plan. So we can use those headings as our requirement, or we can just use the straight risk we've identified and use that as our requirement and make that our heading. What's our status here? Is this a planned implementation? Is it already in process and we're working through it? Have we identified that, you know what, this originally we thought was an issue, but after further analysis, it's no longer an issue at all. It's not applicable to us. Or this is something we have not implemented and it's undetermined if we're going to or not. We're going to look at that. So you want to be able to put um, your flair, if you will, on these risk items and say, here's how we're going to move forward with it. This one is planned. This one's not planned. This one we're going to hold for a future date and reconsider. And then we can work through the process. Who's responsible for this uh, item? Who's going to help us mitigate it from either a implementation standpoint, a planning standpoint, whatever the case may be? This can be, it has to be one individual has to be responsible. There can be multiple individuals or groups or vendors involved, but somebody has to own it. And we want to identify everything with an owner. That gives us that accountability. It gives us that assurance that, hey, so-and-so has this, it's in their plate. We've communicated to them what they need to do, and it just makes your process much smoother. So always make sure these are assigned to an individual. Then you can start planning, resources. This is going to be, it's going to need a dedicated server. It's going to need uh, additional electrical support. So you can start identifying what some of those resources might be and trying to throw budgetary numbers at them. Just if there is going to be an additional cost, let's try and identify it. And even if you can't, you can at least identify the fact that, hey, we know this is going to cost us more. We just don't know what it is. There's a lot of things you can do that don't cost you anything more. You already have services, you already have controls at your availability. They're just not configured to meet these requirements. Those can be configured um, at either low or no cost because you have them. You just need the expertise to configure them. Office 365 is a great example of that. There are so many security features within Office 365 that aren't being used that can really make your life easier. I'm assuming you're using Office 365, of course, but things that will actually evaluate email and attachments for financial information. And if it sees that in there, take action. And that action could be block the message, notify the recipient that, hey, this message came in, but we can't deliver it to you. Notify the sender that, hey, you're sending information that looks like it's sensitive financial information. You want to reconsider, you want to send it through an encrypted means. There's a lot of different functionality that you can do in those systems. Google Workspace has a lot of the same functionality or their variation of it. So you definitely want to look at those. Firewalls are another device that you have in your networks. Anybody that in the office will have a firewall protecting them from the internet. That device has tons of security features that typically are never configured because there's just almost too many to consider unless you know the business operations and you know the impact of making those changes. Well, you guys do. You do know your operations. You do know the impact of flipping switch A to position B. All you need is somebody that might need to explain to you, well, this is how we flip it from A to B. And this is what it's going to do to the actual technical aspect of it. And then you can turn and start building on the impact and what it's going to do and if you have to make changes. So there is partnership, there is synergy between different individuals, different skill sets, different knowledge sets, and you'll want to take a look at that. Got a note here I just want to follow up on in the comments about company opts for a hosted cloud tax software like Intuit. Does this absolve us of liability in the event of a breach? So the answer to that is going to be, depends on what the breach is. So if it's a breach that occurs, so this is a vendor that is providing you a web-based platform that you can access, but they control where the data is stored. I believe. I don't believe you have any control over that with Intuit Service. They control um, which of their systems and who within Intuit has access to support that platform, manage that data repository. They should not have access to the data itself, just where it's located, but they wouldn't be able to look at the data. So if the breach happens on the back end, meaning their network is compromised and the data is therefore compromised, then it is their responsibility. If the breach happens on your side because you were incorrectly applying user security permissions or allowed a user to gain access through um, a compromised account, they did a phishing scam against one of your staff, got an email account, got a compromised an email account, got credentials for their Intuit out of there, and signed into Intuit, then you would be responsible for that breach. So it's going to depend on how the access occurred and what that breach actually was. Um, but the vendor, what you're talking about here is what's a transfer of risk. Where can we, one of the easiest ways to mitigate risk is make it someone else's responsibility. So that's where these vendors provided solutions become attractive, because now you don't necessarily have to worry about it. You have to make sure you're choosing a vendor that's responsible and is implementing their own security practices, but that's part of your supply chain risk management. And there's a much lower cost involved in that than there is putting these systems in place and protecting them yourself. So there is a trade-off there, but then you have the added cost of paying that vendor for those services. So it's just you got to look at what fits your needs, and how you're going to move forward from a budgetary standpoint. So I hope that answered that question about the who responsibility or the liability, on what that would be in a vendor relationship. Um, it would, and then the second part of that question is, would it mean that you could afford less focus on adhering to the FTC guidelines if we've transferred that risk and that liability off to a vendor? Um, I wouldn't say it's less focus. There's just going to be less detail in our information system security plan, because now we're going to be able to say that, in our vendor sections, that this is sensitive data stored in this platform, controlled and protected by vendor A. And then in our supply chain risk management section, we'll say vendor A has provided attestation to security controls that satisfy FTC safeguards, evidenced by the SOC 2 report attached, something along those lines. So I wouldn't say it's less focus. It's just a different focus. We're going to move that effort to different areas of the information security plan, but certainly less on the implementation side, no doubt. Less on the risk analysis side, no doubt. Okay, we talked about implementing, or I'm sorry, assigning responsibilities. I just can't stress enough. You have to have people tagged as you are doing this, and that person knows they were told that they're doing it, and they know what the expectations are. So a lot of people like to do, I like to do this. I'll have a meeting and then somebody won't show up. Well, if they don't show up at the meeting, they get assigned everything. Oh, well, they're not here, they're going to get, right. Everybody likes to do that. But that's not actually practical in its execution. It's fun to do. That's consequence of not showing up at a meeting. But really what we want to do is assign those tasks to somebody who can effectively drive it to completion, can manage that task, maybe not do it. That's not the same thing, but actually follow through and make sure that the people that can do it do execute and complete it, that it meets your needs, that it's done in the time frame it needed to be done in, did within the budget it needed to be accomplished in, and that's what I'm talking about here. So really, one person cannot do it all. I'm just going to You can. I'm going to take that back. One person can do it. It just takes much longer if it's only one person doing it. If you can spread it out and involve multiple members of your organization, it will take less time. You will have better understanding across the organization because more people are involved. That information will flow down easier. You'll have different perspectives and viewpoints to bounce ideas off of. It's just much more effective if you can do it with a group, even a small group. Even two is better than one. I would say no more than 4 or 5 becomes unwieldy. Uh, so I would say keep it small. But any of those tasks, we want to make sure they're assigned to an individual. They're on our plan. They've got due dates. They've got budgets, if a budget is applicable, and we can manage to that. So always keep that in mind that we always want to do that. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, back to our plan of action. So this is the key piece, right? So we've done our inventory, we've done our analysis, and we've determined the things that need to be implemented. And now we're managing all of that through this plan of action. They call it in the WISP in their documentation. They refer to something called an implementation clause. So this plan of action is really going to directly support that implementation clause. And my recommendation would be that you refer to your plan of action in the implementation clause, stating that you've got uh, these controls in place, or expecting to complete all requirements by this date, evidenced by our plan of action. And you continually maintain this plan of action. We update it with the items as we're progressing through it, because some of the items that you're going to come up with are going to be complicated to deal with. Some of them are going to be maybe budgetary impossible today. It's just we can't do this today. We didn't plan for it. We just don't have the funds. It's going to be moved to uh, you know Q the end of Q2 for 2024. Let's get it on our planner so we know it. So what this provides you is, in the event of an audit, something, God forbid, something went wrong, right? We lost some information. Uh, we had a ransomware attack. Data was encrypted and exfiltrated. Now it's living off in the ether somewhere, um, and we're gonna sustain an audit. FTC, whether the FTC does it or the IRS does it, I'm not sure at this point, but somebody's going to come and evaluate your environment. They're going to evaluate it against these safeguards. And unfortunately, the nature of us auditors, assessors, is that we're very subjective. We want to see what we want to see. We're going to look at these guidelines, and we're going to go through them. But I can guarantee you that any auditor that comes into your environment is going to be looking at things other than those bare requirements. So just be prepared for that. There's nothing you can do. I mean, I'm just letting you know. But also, when you're validating or responding to that audit, be able to say that, hey, this was uh, known to us. We were working on it. Here's our plan. This is where we're at on it. Or, well, I understand your point, Mr. Auditor or Mrs. Auditor, but that's not required by the safeguards rule, and we didn't address it. And give them a chance to be the educator. Don't be confrontational. Don't deny. Always respond to them with a question. Give them the ability to educate you rather than penalize you, to partner with you rather than punish you, and you'll get much further out of that situation and actually be able to make some improvements, because they will make recommendations that you can do going forward. So just a quick tidbit should you suffer an audit, and suffer is the correct word. But at any rate, having the plan of action, though, is your evidence, your proof that we've been working on this. We didn't just say this is what we have and this is what we don't have and leave it alone. We've been working to improve this process and make these controls available, and protect this information over the course of the year. And here's our proof that we're doing it. Here's how we're managing it, and so on. So the plan of action is really, this is where we're documenting the work that's being done and our plans for when we're going to do it. I can't say enough about how important it is. So once we've completed those other steps, they're done. We put them aside. We focus on this, the plan of action. Now we're ready to write our security plan. So all those pieces got us to the point where we're actually ready to put this down as a security plan and make it enforceable. So you can see that this is actually the easy part. We've done all the hard work up to this point to identify all the systems we need to be concerned about, all the devices, all the ways that users can access that information, the information types itself. What are the risks associated with those? What's the impact to the organization should they be compromised? What's the cost? What's the probability? We've planned how we're going to mitigate those risks. We've got a plan of action that is in progress to implement controls to mitigate the identified risks. And now all we have to do is document in our information security plan some of that inventory information, some of the controls that we're establishing and putting in place, some of the identified risks to make sure that our plan is addressing the risk items that we wanted to address. And then the rest of it's, I don't want to say fluff, but it's going to be information that you can pull from the data we've already collected. So, as I said, the process is very linear. We start at the beginning and we work it through 1, 2, 3 to the end. And at this point, we're ready to actually put our results down on our information security plan using the format that is provided in that sample, that written information security plan sample from the IRS. That's a great outline. I would recommend you follow that outline from a topical standpoint, but the content needs to be 100% unique to your environment. If you're copy and paste stuff out of that sample and you're using it in your plan, it won't go well for you should an audit occur. And I would also opine, I guess, I think the requirement to have a written information security plan is a great first step. It's needed as a country. We need to do a better job protecting this personal information. The impact to the victims of a personal information data breach, and if anybody on this presentation has been a victim of that, it is, you can't measure it. The identity theft possibilities, home title. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and people can be financially ruined with no recourse because you or your organization didn't protect that information. The costs of it and the impact of these breaches is just too much to deal with any longer. And there's going to be more and more legislation around it. There's going to be more and more requirements tied to that legislation. And one of the requirements I expect you're going to see sooner rather than later is that you're going to have to provide your written information security plan, not just say you have one. You're going to have to give a copy of it to them. That's already happening in the defense realm. We do a lot of work with DoD partners, and they must provide a copy of their information security plan with their. There's a bunch of other stuff they got to do, but that has to be included with it because they gave up trusting them for years. They told them you must comply with these requirements, and there was a checkbox on their contracts that said organization ABC attests that they meet these requirements. Check. It had a check mark in it. Well, after almost 10 years of continual data breaches of sensitive information relating to our national defense, they finally got fed up with it and said, "This, we can't, you guys aren't doing what you said you were going to do. So here's the ramifications. A, you will provide a copy of your information security plan. We will score the quality of your information security plan. If you do not have one, you will not do business with the Department of Defense. If you do submit one and we audit you and it's in violation of your plan, you will be fined. You may be charged against the for filing false claims, and now you're facing criminal charges. So there's a there's a long way for these things to play out. And again, I'm not trying to scare you because we're in a good spot here. We're going to be able to get our plan in place, and we're going to be able to be ahead of that request when it happens. So it's all good, but the industry, the nation as a whole, um, there's just got to be changes made. We have to do a better job of protecting that information. And right now, the only leverage uh, the country has is obviously, legal, making laws to enforce it, and then the departments that are responsible for enforcing that law are doing they're getting creative. I'll just be honest with you, they're getting creative. It's happening at the state level, federal level. You have states attorneys that are filing charges against organizations for negligence because they didn't take any steps to protect sensitive data. So this isn't just a formality of creating this information security plan. This has meaning, this has impact, and that's the goal we're trying to achieve, is protecting that information to minimize the exposure and impact to the victims of these breaches. You may think of your organization as being the victim, but you are, but there's that downstream victim of that, the people whose information was compromised. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through these processes, because that's really the goal, is protecting them. You're just a conduit for this attacker to go get those people. So you have a critical role to play in protecting uh, us, American citizens, your customers, whether they're American citizens or not. You have that responsibility. So let me get off my soapbox for a second, but um, we want to get in and get that WISP built. So let's talk about the topics. I mentioned the outline that's in the uh, IRS example. Good outline from the topic standpoint. Content has to be your own. We have to put it in your own terminology, your own operational environment. This is another good area where the NIST cybersecurity framework, and I'm going to put those links in again at the end of the presentation. I'll put them in the chat so they're easily accessible to you. But the NIST cybersecurity framework, along with the references that are provided in it, excuse me, will really help you determine what content you need to put under these topics. So if we're looking at the data collection and retention section, or data disclosure, or network protection, finding a relevant category in the NIST cybersecurity framework, and then using those references to guide you as to A, possible solutions, or B, just a more detailed analysis of what of how to review that requirement to determine your solution, will go a long way for you. And it doesn't take long. The cybersecurity framework's a PDF file. You can open it up, hit Control F, or if you're on a Mac, I guess it'd be Command F. I'm not sure anymore. Type in uh, inventory, and it'll start. Boop, boop, you just go through, find the items that you think are relevant. You can jot them down. You can go back to them later, whatever the case may be. But um, definitely a worthwhile resource in supporting your efforts in developing your WISP, your risk analysis, and so on. This is, and the reason I bring up the NIST cybersecurity framework as much as I have, is it is going to become a more prevalent guidance for cybersecurity initiatives. It's being adopted by various departments within the federal government. It's adopted by states. It's adopted by other countries. There's a consortium working on the revision of it to make it more applicable to other entities. And it itself is not a cybersecurity requirement. It is a guidance. It's a framework. It's really a good tool to utilize to better protect your environment and understand what's in it. So it can be very helpful. And let's see. Oh, I do want to talk about a couple other things here real quick. One, reportable incidents. This is going to that incident response plan. As I said, if you're under 5,000 customers, the IRS isn't requiring you to have a written incident response plan. In my opinion, you can't have a valid incident response plan without it being written. You can't just know, hey, if something happens, I'm going to call this phone number. That doesn't cut it. It just doesn't. There's too many things that need to happen in a true incident response. As I mentioned earlier, contacting your lawyer. Under what conditions are you going to decide that we need to contact our legal representation? The last thing you want to do is while you're sitting in your house and it's on fire, try to figure out, well, what's my escape route? What am I doing for fire suppression? Those things all should have been planned before the emergency. That's what an incident response plan is. We outline um, certain requirements, identify if this happens, then we take this action. If this happens, then we take this action. Now, obviously, we can't foresee everything, but we can group them into types of categories that make it manageable so that when something does happen, you're not trying to figure out the solution. All you're trying to figure out is where's my incident response plan because my solution's in there. So having that documented, and it doesn't have to be a voluminous document. It can be a couple of pages of a Word doc or Google Doc, whatever the case may be. But you need to put that stuff down. Who are the important contacts? Who's my insurance provider? What's their um, uh, my agent's name and number? What's the policy number I need to refer to? Uh, State wise, what are my state legal requirements for incident reporting? Every state is different. So I wish I could say, follow this. They're all the same. They're not. Each state is different. Your source for that is your state attorney general. So almost all will have it published on their website, but start with your state attorney general's office, and that will be your guidance for finding what are my reporting requirements for incidents, for privacy breaches, and so on. So I know the written incident response plan is not a requirement for many of you. You can't do it without it. Take the time to put that information in it, document it, and you have it. And you're good to go as we go forward. Employee code of conduct. So it's just interesting that they would use this term. In most places, it's referred to as like an acceptable use policy um, or acceptable behavior, things of that nature. I don't care what the name is. What we're after is informing the staff of the rules of conduct we expect them to follow to protect this information, to support our information security plan. So they're not going to know it inherently. They weren't part of developing it to the extent you were. Um, they don't necessarily understand all the risks because they weren't part of that process. So giving them that information in a written statement, whether it's a part of your employee handbook, whether it's a separate, document you're going to put together that you can is easier for you to keep current, whatever the case may be. But you want to give the staff, all workforce members is the generic term, that guidance. This is what you're expected to do. This is what you're allowed to do. This is when you're allowed to do it. This is where you're allowed to do it from. To whatever detail you think is reasonable for your organization, and get them to acknowledge that. Whether you have a training session, hey, everybody, let's jump in the conference room. We're going to go over this. And we want them to acknowledge that they understand it. So somewhere there's got to be a sign off. So all of this stuff, always, anything to deal with compliance requirements, always requires acknowledgement by somebody. So sign offs on things are always, everything you do, somebody needs to initial, someone needs to sign it, whatever the case may be. It's just part of the process. So in this, informing your staff of their expected and accepted activities is critical. And that's what that employee code of conduct is. Nothing we addressed really as part of the WISP itself, but it is a component of it. And you would make sure you want to have that. Again, I would have a separate code of conduct policy. I would reference it in my WISP. I wouldn't list the whole thing in there. I would just say we have a employee code of conduct that outlines, blah, 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 and has been acknowledged by all workforce members or something like that, and you'd be covered. But we need to make sure we have that employee conduct or a code of conduct in case someone comes looking for it. Plus, we want to make sure our staff know what's going on. I think that pretty well covers most of those items. We get into some of the technical information on, network protection, user access, remote access. And what you want to do in your WISP is, so you want to prevent it from becoming something that could increase your risk. So we don't want to put too much information in here related to our specific configurations, or certainly don't want to identify usernames, people other than the one we have to designate as being responsible for the plan. That's a requirement. We have to say this person, but we don't have to put contact info in there or anything like that. So we want to refrain from making the written information system security plan a protected document. So, keep PII out of it, keep certain technical information out that would allow an attacker to exploit your environment. So we don't want to give them, information if this thing falls into the wrong hands. The other piece to that is this document, this plan, should be treated as sensitive information. You want to protect it, because inevitably you may end up putting some of that information in it that we wouldn't want disclosed, whether it's business related information or technical data that could put you at risk. It's possible that it'll end up in there. So you just want to make sure you protect this document and the components of it just like you would PII, and making sure that it's limited who has access to it. It's in a place where we know who accessed it. We got an audit trail. All revisions are monitored, or not monitored, recorded, that type of thing. So just keep that in mind, that this becomes a sensitive document itself and you want to protect it as such. All right, the maintenance. So it's great that we finished it. We got our plan, we got controls in place. We still have more controls we're working on, but we've been able to document our information security plan. And now we just need to follow it, right? We put all that effort into creating rules, and that's what the information security plan is. It's your rules for how you're going to operate and protect that information. So now we just have to follow the rules. So it sounds easy, but everybody has to be trained on them. So everybody needs to know what are our rules. So everybody has to understand your information security plan. They have to understand where they have responsibilities. They need to know how to execute those responsibilities. So that's a big part of it right up front. Training, get everybody up to speed. Um, Number two is, how do we keep it current? So as we're going through our daily existence, change happens all around us all day long. Well, the same thing happens to your technology, to your systems, to the way you access information, changes all day. Um, Vulnerabilities are disclosed around, um, I'll use Google Chrome for an example. I mean, they've been coming out with, I don't know, at least 2 or 3 a month of vulnerabilities to the Chrome browser that could allow an attacker remote control of your computer. So how do you stay on top of those things? How do you stay on top of your rules around how are we identifying vulnerabilities in our environment? And that's where you need to look at how those things apply at an operational aspect. How are we doing this? What do we do to measure it? What do we do to audit that those controls are still in place? So there's a little bit to consider there about keeping it current. The easiest way to do it, in my opinion, is break it into chunks. So we have a lengthy information system plan or a security plan. Let's break it into logical sections, 1 or 2 at a time, maybe 3, and review each of those sections, or that selected section, each month. That's a good cadence. I can dedicate a couple hours a month to doing uh, that review of that element, updating the committee that's working on this to say, okay, I think we need to consider this change, or we should be removing this item because we no longer have that in our asset inventory. So that's where you're going to do that update uh, activity, keep the plan current. It needs to reflect your current environment and your current state of operations. It doesn't do any good to have an information security plan that doesn't apply to your information. So as an auditor, if should an audit happen, and again, in your case, the only time you should be audited is in the event of a incident where you've had to report an incident, and now they need to come in and evaluate, okay, were you doing everything you were supposed to do? So in that event, should that happen, you want your plan to reflect what's in your environment. Now, there's always going to be changes that occur that didn't get documented in the plan. because you just can't update the plan as fast as changes occur. We have to stay on top of it. You have to show that you're making an effort to do that. And this review cadence is something that you can establish, control, and that will demonstrate that you're doing it. Once a year, I have a lot of customers that like to do it once a year. Well, let's just sit down once a year and review this whole thing. It's like, dude, you're looking at, taking a week out of your life to do this start to finish, minimum. Is that something you really want to do? Let's take it in small bites throughout the course of the month of the year, whether it's once a month, maybe once a quarter if it's a smaller environment. I wouldn't suggest going any more frequent than once a month. If you think it needs to be done more than once a month, then you need to have more people, and you can spread it out. And somebody reviews this section 1 month, somebody else reviews that section 1 month, and that's where we can do some of those parallel activities. But it's got to be a manageable cadence that doesn't impact the workflow. So you want to keep that going that way. And then exercise it. How do we test it? How do we make sure it's working? How do we know that the controls we put in place are doing what we said they were do, or what we intended them to do? How do we know that nobody's breaching our controls? So regular tests, these can be done annually. There's several tests you want to do, and you can break them out. Quarter one, we'll do this test. Quarter two, we'll do that test. Incident response testing. So you want to have your IR plan. You just run through it in a tabletop exercise. Theoretical activity. Hey, we just had a ransomware event. What do we do? Well, let's grab our incident response plan and make sure that everything we need is covered in here. Disaster recovery plan, same thing. Once a year is sufficient, but you want to go through that exercise of, okay, we've had to close the office for an unforeseen amount of time due to a sewer backup that is not going to be fixed due to lack of funding by the city. We got to go somewhere and work. What do we do? You look at your disaster recovery plan, you look at your business continuity plans, and you run through that scenario. And you say, hey, well, we didn't account for something like this. Let's modify our plan, get it up to speed to address this type of circumstance. DR tabletop incident response. Then you can do some other testing around your controls. So what can we do to trigger the controls that you have in place to be sure that they're actually working? How can we attempt an attack, if you will? How can we simulate that to ensure that the controls you have in place are doing what they need to do? Pen testing, vulnerability testing to a certain extent, those are key things to accomplishing that. So looking at ways that we can verify what we put in place is working, and that we're updating our plans as needed to stay current with what's happening in our environment, and making sure that everybody in the workforce knows their role, knows what's expected, knows how to report an incident. Start with the basics. Hey, if something has happened and these are indications that something's happened, you need to tell somebody. Here's who you tell. Just starting as simple as that. That could be a long way to go. So the maintenance of it, ongoing. We don't want it to be burdensome. We want it to fit with other activities within the organization. Maybe you can align it with budget planning, with employment reviews. You have a variety of different things that you can simulate that type of cadence with. Okay, just a couple things to wrap you up here and let you guys on your way. What's the goal of the FTC safeguards rule? If anybody feels like chiming in the chat, go ahead. I'll allow that. I am actually going to take a quick sip of water real quick. Give me just a second. Much better. Thank you. So the goal of the safeguards rule is to protect personally identifiable information, personal financial information. We're trying to protect that data that would put your customers at risk. And that's the whole point of the FTC safeguards rule. How do they do that? By requiring you, the holder of that data, the custodian of that information, to demonstrate your commitment and your application of proper security safeguards to protect that data. But the goal is protecting me, protecting your customer from that breach. As an organization, you have ways to deal with it. You have cyber insurance, you have legal ramifications. As the consumer who's had their identity stolen, there aren't many options. And that's what we're out to protect. So just keep that in mind. Yes, we're satisfying their requirements, but the reason they've established this requirement is to protect us. What do I need to know to comply with the rule? That changes every day. So what you need to know today is what we've covered in our discussion. You need to go on your own knowledge journey. There are things you're going to learn as you prepare. There's a great deal you're going to learn as you go through the process. The experience of doing it is truly valuable. It really will. It'll make the ongoing process so much easier once you go through it and have a full understanding of it. But really, I think the biggest takeaway is knowing what's the intent of the rule. And the intent is to protect that personal information from getting out to unauthorized people, to bad people, and ruining someone's life. That's the intent of that rule. That's what you need to know to comply with it. Just keep that in your mind that that's the reason we're doing this. And then as you put your controls in place and you're analyzing your risks, you can frame it in the right perspective and you're going in the right path. What happens if you don't take reasonable precautions? So I should have said that at the very beginning. One of the requirements of the information security plan is that it's reasonable and appropriate for your organization. Reasonable is not a choice you get to make. Um, Reasonable is going to be determined by the entity that's evaluating your environment post incident. So we've already had something happen, we've reported that incident, and now we are being assessed to determine if our precautions were reasonable. That's someone's judgment. So what I would say to you in this area is you do what's practical for your organization. You do what you think is reasonable from a cost standpoint, from an impact standpoint, and from an actual value. What's it actually doing uh, as far as safeguarding that information? And when you have those limits in mind and you know where you're at, try to go just a little bit further than that. Try to give yourself a little wiggle room. That reasonable is going to be totally subjective to auditors, to legal minds. They, it just is. Uh, there's not a definition of what's reasonable because there is no definition. So be prepared for the unexpected. One of the ways to stay ahead of that is the continual maintenance and updating of your information security plan, right? So the fact that you are taking that effort to review, update it, make it current, even if you don't make changes, but you document in the plan was reviewed on this date, its new effective date is August 16th, 2023. That proves to me that you've reviewed the plan, you've reissued it, it's reinforced, and that by itself is one of those items that is considered a reasonable precaution. You're taking the effort, investing the time and the resources to maintain your security. Maintaining it is a big key to this. It's not just one and done. Maintaining it helps assure reasonability. When should I start my plan? If there's anybody who hasn't at least started thinking about this yet, we're probably in trouble. So yeah, you should be working on it today. I mean, it was a requirement. It was supposed to have been in place, I believe June 8th, I think was the deadline. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was it. So you were supposed to have one in place at that point. So if you don't, the sooner we get started on it, the better off you're going to be. And then how long do you think it'll take to become compliant? When I say compliant here, I mean, actually have my plan fully developed. Um, it depends on the organization, the resources you can put to it, what other, competing factors are involved. For most companies, I would say this is going to be a 3 to 6 month journey. So, I mean, if you got started on it now, you could most likely be done, this year, going into 2024 with a full plan. And when I say full, it's everything that we've gone through today, all the inventory, all the risk analysis, all the planning that you need to put into it, and then the implementing the controls that you identified were needed through that planning. So it's not a small task, but it does take time. So I would say 3 to 6 months would be uh, very common. I've seen others that could throw a ton of time and money and people at it that could do it sooner. I've seen more commonly organizations that didn't have time, money, or people, and it took them a year or more. So how long it takes could be an issue should something come up. But if you haven't even started it, if you can't show that you're working on it, that you're trying in good faith to achieve these things, you're really going to be in trouble. And if you attested that you do have a written information security plan, but you don't have it, then I would think time is more of an enemy for you. The sooner you can get something down, the sooner. And actually, in that case, if that's what the situation you're in, you may look at, well, how do I write an information security plan that will meet that requirement? And then how do I go back and do it the right way to get it updated and make it accurate? I wouldn't suggest that as a strategy, but if you feel you're in a position that would be a more responsible approach to getting your plan in place, um, if you do it with good intent and you do it with good content, I think that would probably work. Uh, David asked if it's the same type of table of 3 to 6 months of outsourced. So that depends on who is being engaged to provide the service. So even though we provide the service, uh, we are totally dependent on you. So we will guide you. We will explain what this means, what that means. We will tell you that this control can be implemented using this. We can do this to audit that. This is what we can do to test the other thing. We can make recommendations all day long. The responsibility of this information security plan lies with you. Anybody who says they're going to come in and write you a plan, they're going to do a risk analysis, they can't, because you're the one that has to sign off on it. You're the one that is attesting that this is accurate and true information. I'm binding my organization to it. A third party can't do that. So it is, you don't have to do as much work when it's outsourced. I'll be honest with you. But you still have to do the work, right? So if we're doing the service with you, we're guiding it, we're doing a lot of the project management part of this effort, where we're saying, okay, this needs to be done next. We're going to do this piece on this date. Tom's going to do that, and we're working through that process with you and giving you that uh, continuation. We've got that momentum, and we're going to keep that going, and giving you the expertise behind it. The decisions, the acknowledgments, all have to come from you, the customer, and we'll guide you and steer you to the best of our ability. But in the end, it's your organization and it's your responsibility. So if you're working with third parties to accomplish some of these activities, that's good, because they can bring a lot to the table. Just make sure that you're not signing something that somebody else prepared that you don't even know what's in it. You need to be a key contributor to the development of that plan when it's outsourced. But it's certainly a viable option, and for us, it's about a 3-month process when we work with a customer, about 12 weeks roughly, to go through from zero to a full assessment to a plan. So I hope that answers you, David. 3 months from our services, and others, can vary depending on what they're providing, I suppose. And some of the answers to some of those questions. Again, I also would say review the FTC safeguards rule. It's not hard. It's not all that long. It's actually pretty easy to read, but take a look at it, understand it. I print a copy out. If I'm working to a standard, I have that as a hard copy that sits right alongside me at my desk. I'm working, everything else is online. I'm working in files and everything else, but I have that hard copy of the standard right in front of me, and I refer to it constantly to make sure I'm meeting those requirements, because that's the measurement stick. So I'm always looking at that. So reviewing that and understanding it, like I said, it's really not that difficult, very easy to get to, and take a look at that guy. We talked about the possible prosecution, and it's there. I want to make you aware of it. It's not the go-to. It's not the government's position to come out and throw everybody on trial for everything. They will look at penalties and fines always. That is their go-to. Criminal prosecution is something they reserve for really egregious violations. But it is there, and it is being enforced more and more. They are pursuing that more and more. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is about all I have for you from a content standpoint. The references that I put in the chat earlier, and I'm going to put them here again in just a second, are included in this reference material slide. So you can see here that there's an FTC breach, data breach response guide. Would be very helpful for looking at while you're developing your incident response plan. Additional data security resources from the IRS. I'd put a little weight on these IRS publications, since the WISP is an IRS requirement. So aligning with their information would probably serve your purposes best. But outside of actual IRS information, the safeguards rule itself, and then any of the NIST documentation. The NIST documentation sometimes is really hard to read. I'm not going to lie to you, but they've got so many resources behind it. It's our government. They're spending money left and right on stuff. This is an area that it certainly adds value. And this information that's in these NIST guidances are very practical when interpreted properly, and certainly achievable. So I highly recommend them as well. And then, my old standby, the NIST cybersecurity framework. We can customize it. We pull out the categories within these functions that are applicable to your organization, give you a great framework for cybersecurity moving forward. It becomes your roadmap. It becomes your information system security plan. Super easy to manage because of the process we put behind it. But it's just a really well-structured, well thought out approach to security that can just be applied in so many different instances. Why reinvent the wheel when they've given us a wheel, literally, that we can apply in our own organization? So a really, really good tool. If you're interested, look it up. Easy to see. They've got a lot of information about where they're going with the new version, and I think you'd find it very helpful. It may be a little bigger picture than what the WISP is, but if you've got the bandwidth and you want to approach security from a security perspective, not necessarily a meeting the requirements of WISP perspective, I recommend taking a look at this and seeing where we can go with it. I believe that is all I had, other than putting these links back in the chat window for you guys, so they're back at the top. There's that. I'll put that there. And then I just want to throw some contact info for you should you need some additional info or would like some additional info. There for you. There you go. Once again, I want to thank the Kentucky Society of CPAs for really bringing us in to talk about a problem. We at the AME Group are about solving problems. That's what this was. I really hope that you guys can take something away from this that you can put into action and make a difference in your plans. And if by any means, if there's anything we can do to help, feel free to reach out and we'll get you answers that you need or additional guidance as possible. So thank you very much. Thank you, Lisa. And I hope you guys have a great day.
Thank you so much, Jay, for the information today. I know this was very helpful to our CPA members of many state societies. So we enjoyed that today. You've got Jay's information. If you need that again, please reach out to your state society or to Lisa. So that my email address is lkemper, Kemper, @kycpa.org. Thanks for attending.